again, '03 is would be an aberration. It's not sustainable on a long-term basis. He views it as, let's cut a deal and then go campaign. There's a $541 million drop in revenue that they need to close that gap that they discovered in May. And if anybody read the paper over the weekend, they saw that number's changed and gone up a bit. The SBAB has been put on a bond cap. It needs to be funded with some dedicated revenues. Thinking that they'll use reserves to fund that, the gap in the '03, in the current budget. And an interesting note, I didn't realize that, but half of the state budget is local aid and Medicaid. Two-way. I found it interesting. Those are the comments from Kevin Sullivan. Then we had an update from John Robertson, the MMA. Again, he's looking for the budget to come out of conference and go to the governor by end of July. He's looking at additional assistance as level funded, lottery as level funded. Education will obviously need to come out of conference with some kind of change. The House is level funded Chapter 70 and provided for the new special education and for the special high enrollment, which North Reading is a participant in that funding. However, on the Senate side, they increased Chapter 70 to bring everybody to foundation budget, but did not address the new special ed. He talked about also SBAB being an issue, and that's where the issue of the 7-year bonding came up. The Senate budget, Chapter 81, was zero funding. Chapter 81 is roadway maintenance, not to be confused with Chapter 90. Public libraries was cut in the Senate budget. And Quinn bill, I think, Quinn bill and payment in lieu were level funded in that budget. Under Chapter 90, which is also roadways, but that's not the maintenance, that's the bonding. There are no more authorizations available, so we may not be funding on that at all. And the one thing he floated out that's being talked about is a local option on meals tax. This being considered, which is another way of passing the buck to us. The good news is, '03 is not going to be as bad as we anticipated. Let me go to the. We did have a finance planning team meeting, and I basically provided the finance planning team with those same two updates. We talked about the budget process, which Mr. Younger and Mr. Dow are working on. Devising a new process. No decision will be made, no final decisions will be made by the finance planning team. That new budget process will come before this board for discussion and approval and input. From a planning perspective, I think that while in the past, in particular in all of May and most of June, I've been unwilling to say that the state aid will come back. I think in the finance planning team, I think sort of a consensus. And Joe, if I missed something,
No, go ahead.
If you let me know. I think there's a consensus that 10% cut is going to come back. What form that 10% cut comes back in is anybody's guess, because the House and Senate are going to go into conference on the budget, and so we're not positive what will come out of that. From a planning perspective, going back to the original budget process in a joint meeting. This was in a joint meeting with the Board of Selectmen, the Finance Committee, and the School Committee. we agreed that additional state funds would be split 60-40. That was a consensus of the boards. The finance planning team is recommending that, at least for the present time, we stick with that. And then from a planning perspective, the school department, if the school department were to plan on the house budget as a base, that would give them additional Chapter 70 funding. I neglected to mention, actually, the Senate budget provides for the Board of Selectmen or Finance Committee and the Board of Selectmen to vote to appropriate additional Chapter 70 funding, which is education funding, without going to town meeting. That was done, was it last year, or it was done last year as well? That language was in the Senate budget, was not in the House budget, but it's likely to come out of the joint conference. So from a planning perspective, it was the consensus of the planning team, and I need some input from the board, but that the school department, they do have a September opening. So from a planning perspective, if they were to plan on the House budget from a Chapter 70 funding perspective, that would equate to, if they were to plan, not spend, the difference. I'm not saying they're going to spend what they don't have, but from a planning perspective, if they were to build into their plans receiving that additional Chapter 70 funding that's in the House budget, that's roughly equivalent to a 60-40 split of the total increase in state aid. And again, I round my numbers, so but it's roughly equivalent. So I need some input from the board on that. Obviously, if somebody has a big issue with that, again, they're not spending it, they're just planning their program needs, et cetera, based on that. And I think that's a reasonably conservative approach at this point, because I think it's fairly certain that there'll be some additional funding.
So the number you're talking about then is the increase in Chapter 70 spending?
Yeah, which would be 321, right?
Approximately.
Yeah, approximately.
So that's roughly 180,000. 60. Are you still talking about 60-40 split of the?
No, I'm saying if you take the total house budget, you take the total 10% reduction, split it 60-40, it would come out 311.
It's roughly 600,000.
If you take this Chapter 70 appropriation, it's 320 something. So if they were to plan on the whole Chapter 70 appropriation, it's 60%. So it's from that's just from a planning perspective.
Where does that put the additional 600,000 at this point?
The additional 600,000.
The 600,000 an increase in state aid, 10%. That's roughly $600,000.
Right. Right.
And they're talking an additional 300,000 in Chapter 70?
No. Of the 600, 300 of it is Chapter 70. It's 6 something.
Well, the letter I received from Representative Jones stated that of an increase, I could be wrong, but my recollection of that is, it's been a while since I read the letter, talked of a $300,000 increase to North Reading in state aid in Chapter 70 funds.
Right.
Okay, and I've been told all along.
That's from the governor's budget.
Okay, and I've been told all along that the 10% reduction in state aid that the budget was based upon, that 10% equals $600,000.
Round numbers, in round numbers.
In round numbers. So are we looking at an additional when we compute the Chapter 70 funding increase and the 10% in restored state aid, are we looking at a total of $900,000?
No, when I say increase state aid, I'm talking the whole buckets. Chapter 70, Chapter 81, et cetera. I'm talking the whole bucket.
Okay, because I have been told in the
Right.
past that the state aid, the 10% cut represented $600,000.
When we reduced, Mr. Chairman, when we reduced the revenues, we took a 10% cut
On everything,
on everything.
across the board, everything. So took Chapter 70, cut it 10%.
Right. But
Took Chapter 81, cut it 10%.
But as I said, the letter I received from Representative Jones stated there was going to be an increase in Chapter 70 spending above last year.
The House, I don't have that letter with me.
I don't either.
The-
to be honest with
The House budget restored Chapter 70 to current funding level. So it eliminated, the House budget basically eliminated the cut in Chapter 70. So it brought it back to where it was. The original budget that we built was 10% cut. The House budget restored it.
you. So there's no increase then in Chapter 70 spending?
No, there's an increase in Chapter 70. When I say state aid, total state aid will not be cut 10%.
Right.
That total cut is some $600,000, and it's a lot higher than that. It's 640 or 650 something.
Okay.
In that number is Chapter 70. So in that number, the Chapter 70 is around $300,000. So from a planning perspective,
But,
because it's
sorry.
from a planning perspective, so if you take the total 640 or 650,000 or whatever the exact number was, I don't have it with me, and you split that 60-40, the 60% of that would be $311,000 to the schools. If you take the House's budget and the increase in Chapter 70 in the House budget is $322,000. So it's 11,000, round numbers, $11,000 different. So from a planning perspective, if the whole 10% comes back, but we don't know the allocation, how much is 70, how much is this, how much is that, can they plan on the Chapter 70 money? That's the question for the meeting.
Well, I guess I'm still a little confused, and maybe it's because my recollection of the letter from Representative Jones isn't as clear as it would have been when I received the letter. I was under the impression that there was an increase, not the restoration of 10%, but the restoration of 10% plus an increase on top of that in Chapter 70 money. Okay, I think I read an article in the transcript that is penned by Representative Jones, stating that also sometime in the last month to 6 weeks. If that's the case, then as I said, I could be mistaken on this. The other thing, I would like to look into that to see if there is an increase over the 10% reduction that had been worked in. We're talking about restoring the 10% and then looking if there's an increase. Plus, I would still, before any planning took place, I would still like to, and we're still talking about having to appropriate that money. That money is money that has not been appropriated yet. I still think we need to go through the regular budgeting process of questions and answers and so forth, based on needs, that we would with any money that we appropriate to any department in town government.